Should I believe in God? I want to believe in God, but I have problems. On the one hand, God seems so obvious. The more we understand the universe, the more majestic it appears. On the other hand, God seems so silly. The more I consider God's human-like traits, the more awkward I feel. Theism is the belief that God exists and that God is the creator. But atheists claim that theism is not coherent, meaning that God as a concept is riddled with inconsistencies and contradictions, or embedded with conflicts between what is claimed about God and what we know about the world. An inconsistent and contradictory God, or even a conflicted God, is a God that could not exist. So, is theism coherent? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. I begin with a leading philosopher of religion, whose pioneering book, The Coherence of Theism, examines how God's attributes work together. Richard Swinburne changed the way I think about God, but I am still not convinced that God exists. But here is what I am convinced about. If God, as I might imagine God, is not coherent, then I must reject the kind of God I imagine. Richard, we're all familiar with attributes of God: omnipotence, omniscience. God's all good, perfectly free. But how do we make sense of these characteristics? How do they get consistency, coherence?
Yes, well, it's often been argued that there are internal inconsistencies in the claims that there is a God. And clearly, if there's an internal consistency, it can't be true. Now, for example, both the notions of omnipotence and the notion of omniscience, it's been supposed that they have internal consistencies.
All-powerful and all-knowing.
That's right. Omnipotence, somebody has said, well, surely an omnipotent being ought to be able to make a stone that it cannot lift. But if it can make a stone that it cannot lift, then there will be something that it cannot do, viz. Lift it. Or if it can't make a stone that it cannot lift, there will be something that it can't do. But an omnipotent being is supposed to be a being that can do anything, therefore there can't be an omnipotent being. The notion of omnipotence is internally incoherent in this way, and therefore it becomes someone who thinks that ultimately these claims do make sense, to express them in a more careful way so that these objections are not available. In the case of omnipotence and the paradox of the stone, which I've given you, there are two different ways out. One may say, well, yes, the omnipotent being can make a stone which is too heavy for it to lift, but there will only be something it can't do if it actually makes the stone, and it doesn't have actually to make the stone, so long as it doesn't do that, it can remain omnipotent, and there's no problem. So there's no problem in a being omnipotent so long as it doesn't abdicate its power by making such a stone. That's one way out. It's not the traditional way out, because it seems to allow the possibility that God could abdicate, as it were, could commit suicide or whatever. And it's generally thought that that couldn't be the case, that God is essentially everlasting and necessary. But then if you think that it's part of God's nature to be essentially everlasting, then it certainly does follow that he cannot make a stone which is too heavy for him to lift. But it then also follows that there is an internal inconsistency in the very notion of a stone which is too heavy for a being who is necessarily everlasting to lift. That will contain that inconsistency. Therefore, the description of this task is itself inconsistent and therefore doesn't represent a true task. So by either of these ways, you can show that the notion of omnipotence can be spelt out in a consistent way, and there are similar ways of dealing with objections to omniscience and so on. You can spell these out in general in consistent ways.
How would you then define what a coherent statement about God is?
Well, it's a statement that doesn't involve any internal inconsistencies, a statement from which you can derive no internal inconsistencies. How can you show that a statement is like that? Well, of course, you can show it isn't if you can actually derive the inconsistencies, but assuming you can't do that, well, you must spell it out at greater length and see whether what you describe is something you can understand. So theologians need to defend their account of God against accusations that it's inconsistent. And part of that defense will be by carefully spelling out definitions. For example, God is omnipotent in the sense that he can do anything logically possible, and by showing that some of the alleged contradictions in the notion of omnipotence arise from suppositions that he ought, if omnipotent, to be able to do what is logically impossible, but that is not required by the definition of omnipotence, which is simply that he can do anything logically possible. If the best explanation you can give of the universe is in terms of an omnipotent, omniscient being, and if it turns out that there are these sort of problems in the suggestion that there can be such a being, then, if that really is the best explanation, then by showing that it's probably true, you've shown that there probably aren't any inconsistencies in this description.
Richard seeks the coherence of theism, meaning that there are no internal inconsistencies in statements about God. And he claims to achieve this coherence by defining terms about God carefully, particularly those about God's attributes. I follow Richard's logic and feel buoyed by his confidence. But even if God is coherent, harboring no contradictions in his character and no conflicts with the world, this would still not make it probable that God really exists. On God, the jury would still be out. For a theist, the only gain in showing God to be coherent would be that atheists would lose a favored weapon to attack such a God. If only I were convinced. I'm nagged by doubts. Is God being saved by clever word games? I'll see a skeptic, one who enjoys dissecting and destroying arguments for God. A professor of ethics, law, and neuroscience at Duke, Walter Sinnott-Armstrong. Walter, one of the arguments against theism is that the various characteristics of God are not coherent. They don't fit together.
Well, first I would want to distinguish consistency from coherence. I think the theological view of God is logically consistent. To be inconsistent would have to imply a contradiction. That's not what's happening here. To say it's incoherent is to say that there's a conflict there between the features of God and other things that we know. The problem of evil brings out one of those incoherences. If God is all-powerful and all-good, you can't understand why there would be so much evil of so many different types in the world. There's another incoherence brought out by another argument, the argument from action. If God is eternal, or if God is even unchanging but in time, you can't understand how God could bring about changes in the world if God doesn't change himself. Or for that matter, how God could be a person if he doesn't change. I've never met a person who doesn't change. What makes somebody a person is the way in which they act and change in the world. So if you had something that doesn't change from one moment to another, it couldn't be a person.
These characteristics have formed as part of the Western canon of theology. Other theological traditions have different views of God.
Oh, sure, there are lots of different theological traditions, but what happens is these theological traditions often interact with other theological traditions, or those theological traditions arise from many different people at many different times, and that's how the incoherence gets in there. So the Old Testament was written by many people, and then the New Testament comes along and there's Greek influence and you get other doctrines. Well, it's not surprising that so many people writing at so many different times would produce different views of God that are incompatible. And if you just add every word's true, there you've got incoherence.
So you would see then the contradiction, the incoherence between different characteristics as opposed to some logical trick of words which really don't have any impact.
I think a lot of the discussions that depend on those logical tricks of words, I completely agree with that characterization of them, but those don't really get at the issues, and most people who believe in God or disbelieve in God know that those don't really get at the issues.
How about some of these other characteristics, like God being omniscient, knowing everything? Some would say that just the statement of knowing everything would so clutter God's mind with all sorts of crazy things that's incoherent on its own value.
Well, I assume that when you say God knows everything, it doesn't mean that God thinks about everything at once. If God knows everything but selects the information that's needed for a particular task, then God can do fine, even knowing everything. I know a lot of different theorems in mathematics, but I'm not thinking about them right now, and I know a lot of historical facts that I'm not thinking about right now. So the clutter comes when you try to access all of that information at once, and I don't see why God would have to do that, as long as you admit that God changes. But if you say God doesn't change, then God doesn't access some information at some times and other information at other times. Instead, God has to access all the information at once. Then there might be a problem.
Well, the theologians have a difficulty, because if they say that God changes, that means that God has a past and God has a future.
Right.
And if God has a past, that means there are things that God can never do again, and that are forever removed from him, and that makes him less perfect. So that's why that doctrine emerged. People are trying to fiddle with God and make him so perfect, and a perfect being would not have events that are no longer accessible, and also events in the future that are not under direct control, because that would be less than perfect.
You've got to have God as unchanging, but you forget that by adding unchanging in order to keep omnipotence, that's going to conflict with active in the world.
Right.
And you lose the omnipotence because now he can't act in the world. And so the problem is to keep the whole thing into a coherent bundle. And even if there's not a logical contradiction in there, I don't see how that's going to happen.
Walter sees incoherence among the attributes of God. God being all-powerful and all-good, and yet there is evil. God being unchanging, and yet has to act. Theologians have well-known responses, of course, but Walter's indictment is not withdrawn. Incoherence for God is no minor matter. If God is not coherent, God cannot and does not exist. Walter assesses God's coherence as a philosopher, seeing incompatibilities between what is claimed for God, particularly in Judeo-Christian monotheism, and what he sees in the world. What about assessing God's coherence as a scientist? I speak with an atheistic philosopher grounded in physics, Quentin Smith. What fallacies about God does Quentin find? Quentin, if I want to prove theism, what I have to do is to expose theism to its most rigorous fallacy analysis. I just can't try to prove theism exists.
Well, there's several fallacies, starting with the fact that they use some part of science as evidence for God, and yet God, as an explanation, is inconsistent with science because it posits an entity, a disembodied mind, that is inconsistent with the fields of science, such as neurophysiology and psychology, that show there's no such thing as a mind without a brain or body, and so God has nothing to cause. And so they pick out just certain parts of science and then ignore all the rest of it, ignore the scientific method.
So it's like cherry-picking science, which creates a logical inconsistency in their whole argument.
Right, because they both accept science and reject it. They accept the part that claims evidence for God, then reject it by claiming that the explanation is theistic. I think the idea, which is they take for granted, is that the God is even conceivable. Because the God they are talking about has no sense organs, has no body, has no brain, and yet is conscious of everything, is creating everything.
Sustaining everything.
Sustaining everything. And when you try and think of it, you can't really think of it. And what's going on in a person's mind when they're thinking of it is that they're thinking of something else. They're kind of mixing in images of something that sort of has a body and sort of doesn't, a fuzzy image. But strictly speaking, that the concept is inconceivable. And I think another argument that should be mentioned is that there's an illusion that all these people believe in God. Because once you ask them what God means, people say something very different. You ask one person, they say they think God is moral goodness. You ask another, they say, well, I think God is love. Another say God is nature. And analytic philosophers, about 2,000, 3,000 of them, they've decided on agreed definition of God. But the general public doesn't agree with them, and the rest of the world doesn't. And so the fact that virtually everybody who says they believe in God, they're using a word that means something different for each person.
Well, some theists would say that they're all right, that God is the embodiment of all of these properties and characteristics. And the fact that God has no body, well, what do you expect? How do you expect the creator, cosmic consciousness, the force behind the universe to have a body? That's anthropomorphizing, and that'd be silly. That the kind of God that it can be God, the only kind of being that can be God, has to have an incorporeal, no body and no sense organs.
Well, there's no basis for that view, because we can imagine larger and larger beings with bodies who could create large segments of our universe. And we could keep getting larger and larger. And each larger segment could be caused by some other very large creative being. But when they say that you need a disembodied mind to cause the universe, the problem is that the concept of a disembodied mind is inconceivable. It's words. You can't really conceive anything when you're saying them. If everything is already explained by a state of the universe being caused by an earlier state, then there's nothing left to be explained. And so explanation is over by the time you finished with a scientific explanation of all the states. You can say, well, end of explanation. Well, what do you want explained?
What's left?
Yeah, there's nothing left to explain.
Cherry-picking science is a serious charge, and theism, to the extent it is guilty, should be called out for this. An example, I suppose, might be when theists follow science to praise the world's order and design, yet do not follow science in that randomness and multiple universes can give the illusion of order and design. On the other hand, a disembodied mind doesn't much bother me. Think about it. Conscious awareness itself is so mysterious. Yet diverse descriptions of God, even conflicting definitions of God, are confusing. I struggle with theism. I'm fixated on God's attributes, how they interact and possibly conflict with each other. So I dig deeper into what it means for theism to be coherent, particularly whether a mind without a body makes sense. I follow Richard Swinburne back to Oxford. Critics of theism try to discourage me by claiming that the statements of theism are incoherent. They logically contradict or are totally meaningless.
Yes. Some of the sentences we utter clearly contain a buried contradiction. Theism claims that God is a person, but a person who doesn't have a body. And a critic might come along, many critics have come along and said, to say that there is a person is to say that there is someone who occupies a chunk of space and therefore must have a body. So there is an immediate contradiction there. So we've got to look at how you show that something is coherent or how you show it isn't. If somebody questions the coherence of a statement, the only way you can show that it is coherent is to describe very fully a state of affairs in which it would be true, and to show that the disputed statement follows from that state of affairs. Now, in the case of theism, they question whether person without body is coherent. So the only way I can make sense, try to persuade them it is coherent, is to describe what this would be like. And I would start by giving a story, not about God, but just about a low-grade spirit who doesn't have a body but is a person. And I would say, well, suppose you find yourself unable to control your body, which you can't make any difference to, but you do find yourself gradually acquiring a different perspective on the world, not looking out from here, but looking out from a position where there is no body. And you find that you can make a difference to things there, but not a difference to things here. And I describe in more and more detail the experiences you would have and what would happen in the room and what you could make a difference to, even though there was no chunk of matter corresponding to your body. And in that way, I would be gradually making sense of, showing you that it was a coherent supposition that there is a bodiless person. Analogously, the only way to show that some supposition is incoherent is to derive a contradiction from it. And if somebody questions whether your derivation is correct, the only thing to do is to go through it more precisely, thoroughly, or produce a different contradiction. It's not an easy matter, either way, to show that something is coherent or something isn't coherent. And one must, I think, give anybody the benefit of the doubt in supposing that if they utter a sentence it's coherent. But there are these ways of trying to show people that what they say is incoherent or what they say is coherent, and theism ought to be open to the same approaches.
What then is the global importance of thinking coherently in theism?
Religion makes a claim about how things are. If the claim is incoherent, it must be false, because if it's incoherent, it's like saying that there is a square with only three sides. This is a straightforward contradiction, because to be a square, you have to have four sides. If something contains an internal contradiction, then it must be false, because the contradiction is false. And so if anybody can show there's an incoherence in theism, then that must be false. But of course, theism can be stated somewhat inaccurately, somewhat loosely, so as to contain these apparent contradictions, and it's the job of the philosopher to state it very carefully so that there aren't any contradictions involved, and I think that can be done. These notions can be tidied up, I believe, in a perfectly precise way, so that there is no contradiction involved.
If God is not coherent, then God does not exist. The God story would be a short story. If something required of God embeds a contradiction, for example, suppose that for God to know everything is logically impossible, or that God's traits are incompatible one with the other, say God being all-powerful and all-good in light of vast evil, then one must conclude instantly that God is a fallacy. Nothing incoherent can be true. But if the concept of God is coherent, if God being all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, and all-free all makes sense, then God may exist or may not exist. Because for God to exist as a real and present creator, it is necessary for God to be coherent, but it is not sufficient. On God's coherence, I lean slightly to Swinburne. with careful definitions and with complex arguments needed to neutralize the problem of evil, theism, God, is coherent. But I do not overstate the significance of God's coherence or God's existence. Because God's coherence more eliminates a negative against God than promotes a positive for God. Coherence is just one hurdle in a long race to determine whether God is closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.